Cadman presents Lorraine Hansberry Speaks Out, Art and the Black Revolution. Selected and edited by Robert Nimiroff. The Beauty of Things Black, Towards Total Liberation. Interview with TV commentator Mike Wallace, May 8th, 1959.
This is Mike Wallace with another television portrait in our gallery of interesting people. Our guest was an unknown, unpublished writer until early this year, when her play Raisin in the Sun came to Broadway and was voted by the New York drama critics as the best play of the year, better even than plays by Tennessee Williams, Archibald MacLeish, and Eugene O'Neill. And now to our story. One night, Lorraine Hansberry, a girl who had dabbled in writing, made a brash announcement to her husband. She was going to sit down and write an honest and accurate drama about Negroes. Miss Hansberry exceeded her own expectations, perhaps. Miss Hansberry, first let me ask you this. As a heretofore unknown writer, a 28 or is it 29-year-old girl, what was your reaction to that kind of acclaim?
Well, I received it happily. I felt that our piece was substantial and honest, and the craft of it rather satisfies me. I think I would have liked it if I just walked in.
John Chapman, the drama critic for the New York Daily News, wrote that he has great respect for your play, but he feels perhaps that part of the acclaim may be a sentimental reaction, an admirable gesture, I think is the way that he put it, to the fact that you are a Negro, and one of the few Negroes ever to have written a good Broadway play.
I've heard this alluded to in other ways. I didn't see Mr. Chapman's piece. I would imagine that if I were given the award because they wanted to give it to a Negro, it would be the first time in the history of this country that anyone had ever been given anything for being a Negro. I don't think it's a very complimentary assessment of an honest piece of work or of his colleagues' intent.
Well, let me quote him. He said, if one sets aside the one unusual fact that it is a Negro work, A Raisin in the Sun becomes no more than a solid and enjoyable commercial play.
Well, I've heard this said, too. I don't know quite what people mean. If they're trying honestly to analyze the play dramaturgically, there's no such assessment. You can't say that if you take away the American character of something, then it just becomes, something else. The Negro character of these people is intrinsic to the play. It's important to it. If it's a good play, it's good with that.
Is it fair to say that even in proportion, very few Negroes have distinguished themselves as playwrights, novelists, and poets? There have been a few, including yourself, but not many. How come?
Well, whether they've distinguished themselves is kind of difficult to discuss, because we always have to keep in mind the circumstances and the framework that Negroes do anything in America, which, of course, is a hostile circumstance. We've been writing poetry since, the 17th century in this country, and publishing. Been writing plays that simply never see the light of day because the circumstances, I say, is hostile.
But the same is not true in the case of Negro athletes, Negro entertainers.
Yes, well,
I think in proportion there are more of them who become hugely successful.
Yes, of course, because one of the features of American racism is that it has a particular place where it allows Negroes to express themselves. We're not very warm to the idea of Negro intellectual exploration of any kind in this country. We presume, or at least the racists do, not me, that it's all right to display physical or musical or other features like that, but don't go writing and don't go trying to suggest that anything cerebral is within our sphere, you see.
But is it possible that there's an additional reason, and that is that Negro dramatists, well, let me quote what you have said yourself. You say Negro dramatists burn to fight the cause. They show the Negro as all good and the white man as all bad. And that isn't truth. Compared with Negro poets who have transcended the color question and present it in sophisticated terms, most of our playwrights are retarded. You said that according to the New York Times about a month ago.
extremely glad that you asked me about that because there was an exchange on this question between myself and the New York Times. I was interviewed by a very capable young woman who, however, certainly misunderstood this. What I feel happens to be exactly the opposite. There's a whole illusion, and I've seen it again and again and again in reference to our play, where people say this is the first time that the Negro dramatist has broken through and presented the Negro character in full scale and many-sided and so forth, where we haven't been hit over the head with a message, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm very glad for the compliments, and I react very warmly to it. At the same time, I really don't know what they're talking about, and I don't know what that statement out of my mouth could possibly have meant, because if anything, we haven't had the benefit of enough Negro writers on Broadway to know what they would say about anything. There are any number of professional playwrights who simply don't get their scripts read by Broadway producers. So I'd be the last person to say that it's because they write poorly. An awful lot of poor scripts get to Broadway, and I don't think that's the reason why theirs don't.
What is the reason why theirs don't?
Racial discrimination in the industry, of course. Broadway simply reflects American life, and American life does not accept Negroes in full equality yet.
You mean to say that if a first-class Negro playwright were to write a commercial play about white people, let us say,
he would, up until this point at least, have had enormous difficulty even getting it read.
just for the fact of being a Negro?
Oh, yes. I attended a Negro Writers' Conference a few weeks ago where this question was dealt with at length, where a number of very fine Negro writers, Bill Branch, Alice Childress, Langston Hughes, were addressing themselves to the fact that one of the primary problems of the Negro writer is to get the producer and the publisher to not assume that he has written something that isn't going to be interesting because it's going to be limited to the Negro question or problem, so forth and so on. Read their scripts.
You do not feel then, or perhaps you do feel, that a good many Negroes themselves grope their way through life in a kind of a color-blinded state. That they do not see the world basically in terms of race conflict and prejudice instead of in terms of human beings?
Of course we do. I do too. And certainly my play is actively a protest play. Actively so. There's no contradiction between protest and art and good art. There's, you know, that's an artificial argument. You either write a good play or a bad play. It doesn't have too much to do with what it is about. People say this or that minority group is so preoccupied with a problem that this diminishes their art. Well, I've always been very pleased, and my husband also, to note that for the last 200 years, the only writers in the English language which we've had to boast about are the Irish writers, who, you know, reflect an oppressed culture.
I saw your play the other night and read The Status Seekers by Vance Packard a few days before. Packard writes that the more successful Negroes in America are trying to become ersatz whites. He writes this: they speak softly and precisely to show they are not noisy low-class Negroes. They prefer to shop at higher-class white stores. They are more desperately absorbed in surrounding themselves with limousines and mink coats even than their white counterparts.
Well, that's a very primitive and unfortunate way to characterize the aspirations of the Negro middle class, which certainly are distinct and are different, I think, from Negro working people. To call anybody an ersatz, any other kind of human being, is a lot of nonsense. I think a much more intelligent discussion of this is the kind that Dr. Fraser of Howard University does in his discussion of the Negro bourgeoisie. There is nothing peculiar or unique or exotic about people having middle-class aspirations. We are about to drown in them in America in terms of our total culture, not with regard to Negroes, but everybody's rather fond of high-powered automobiles and what they consider to be the refinements of a better way of life.
Well, it's a tremendous amount of
If you're
fun.
asking me, though, I'd like to speak to that. I do come from the Negro middle class. I do come from people who embody much of typical middle-class aspiration in American life. At the same time, however, I deliberately chose the class background of the people who are the characters in A Raisin in the Sun, because my own particular point of view is that most of what we hope for as a people, most of what we hope for, our ultimate stature as a people, is going to come from these people who are the base and the backbone of our people.
Is there none of you in your play?
The college student.
I thought Beneatha, because in an interview you said whimsically, she's a mess. She's me 8 years ago.
This is true.
Would you elaborate?
Well, I had a great deal of fun with this character because First of all, I knew that if the play ever got to Broadway, that she would be a kind of character that people had never seen before. A Negro girl with intellectual pretensions of any sort is just unknown to the theater. And I also had just a great deal of fun making fun of her a little bit, because it's sort of a pleasure to sit back 8 years later and look at yourself as you think you were.
There's a tremendous amount of talk about assimilationism. In her particularly, she's mutilating her hair, I gather, to make it straighter.
Mutilation is not proper. She straightens her hair, yes. But what do you...
Well, this has nothing to do... you were talking
what
about...
she reflects, if you're interested in the character, really, symbolically, is a very legitimate and active sentiment among American Negro intellectuals and among much larger sections of Negro life that repudiates much of what has come to us through a cultural experience, a historical experience, that we think is not necessarily as valid as we have been told that it is. And since the 30s, there's been quite a movement that feels that what we want now is a recognition of the beauty of things African, of the beauty of things black. And this girl represents part of this development, as I do, I think.
If we can generalize, do you think that Negroes generally set high enough standards for themselves, intellectually, professionally, in education?
High enough standards?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think they set extremely high standards.
You mentioned sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, who obviously is a man you respect. He said that the middle-class Negro is less competent than his white counterpart, quote, because he doesn't have to compete with whites. The Negro professionally said makes excuses for his deficiencies. He likes to complain to white people, we're a poor race trying to get up in the world. You shouldn't expect us to measure up to your standards.
Yes, well, Dr. Fraser, of course, is speaking from within the veil, and he's speaking with an intimacy that you might not as readily understand. It's impossible to discuss the Negro as an abstraction unto itself in this country. So that what he's saying is basically true, that because of the isolation, the separation that our people are forced to endure, this particular group cannot come face to face with some of the more acute realities of what they're trying to overcome, because they just don't get there. They don't become bankers. They don't get an opportunity to deal with those actual things. That has nothing to do with them not having their sights on it.
Well, what about the note that is struck repeatedly in your play, particularly by the son? He says things like this: we're all tied up in a race of people that don't know how to do nothing but moan, pray, and have babies.
He's an individual. He's one character in a play.
Representative of no one.
Oh, representative of a good many people. This is inner group bitterness. When one can't speak against anything else, one indicts one's own, you know? This is very common. People have done this always. And he means this to hurt. It's a line that's directed to his wife in the play. It's a way of turning the attack within for his own personal reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you had a conversation with Walter Lee Younger, he'd have other things to tell you. But in that moment, he's trying to hurt her.
Lorraine, the young girl, Benita, who was you 8 years ago, I gather, is a rebel in many ways, including religion. She even says this. She says, God is just one idea I don't accept. I just get tired of him getting credit for all the things the human race achieves through its own stubborn efforts. The girl adds after that speech, there simply is no blasted God, there is only man. And it is he who makes miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a lot of Lorraine Hansberry in that?
Yes, yes. I feel that ultimately most of the mystical ideas that man has had about how and why he's going to change his own life and change the universe will disappear, and he will ultimately rely on more concrete things like science, like intelligence, like reason. And I hope so.
In the play, the mother slaps the girl when she says that.
Yes.
Is there an experience within your own past similar to that?
No, I was never slapped.
Never slapped?
Oh, no, not in that kind of exchange. What that represents is a character statement of the mother. This is a very strong woman. This is a woman who keeps her authority in any way that she has to, emotionally, physically, however. I think she's a great woman. I think she can be wrong, terribly wrong.
Your play is performed nightly now to standing room audiences, most of them white people, at least the night that I was there. Now, aside from the obvious motives that a good many of them have, simply they want to see a good play, can you think of any other motives that some people might have to want to see a play about a Negro family? This is the first time, as you will agree, that this kind of play has gotten this kind of a reception.
Well, it's really difficult for me to try and guess what other reasons they would have. The tradition has been, and we were told rather often, that people weren't interested in seeing a straight drama about Negroes. So if for some reason it has reversed itself, and they are now interested to see it partially because it is Negroes. I don't understand it, can't explain it, and I'm quite glad about it.
When your Negro family finally, in the play, decides to move into the white neighborhood, I think the audience is pleased and proud. Do you think that they just want to see it on stage and it becomes a kind of a catharsis for them, but they don't want to see it for themselves?
Probably both things are true. I suspect, and if I have any deep feelings at all as a writer, I have a suspicion of the universal humanity of all people, and I think it is possible to reach it. And I believe in the moment when they are sitting in the theater and they murmur in favor of the family and they applaud the particular action, I believe that almost every human being there genuinely wishes this to happen. Now, to what extent any member of an audience comes out of a theater at any time and retains the emotion of a moment within the theater, I certainly couldn't begin to guess. I think in a much larger way that it may have affirmative effects.
Lorraine, unlike perhaps the vast majority of serious writing in America, your play ends on an affirmative note. And in explaining that, you once said, I think the human race is obviously worth saving, ridiculous as it can be. Would you care to go on about that a moment?
Well, yes, I think that for me, this is one of the most affirmative periods in history. I'm very pleased that those peoples in the world whom I feel closest to, the colonial peoples, the African peoples, the Asian peoples, are in an insurgent mood and are in the process of transforming the world, and I think for the better. I can't quite understand pessimism at this moment, unless, of course, one is wedded to things that are dying out, which should die out, like colonialism, like racism, and so forth. Walter Lee Younger and his family are necessarily tied to this international movement, whether they have consciousness of it or not. They belong to an affirmative movement in history. Anything that he does that is the least positive has just implications that embrace all of us. I feel that his moving into the new house, his decision, is in a way a reply to those who say that, you know, all guilt is equal, all questions lack clarity, that it's hard to know what you should fight for or against, that there are things to do, that the new house has many shapes, and that we must make some decisions in this country, as this man does, I
Isn't
think.
there another side to this coin of racism, though? Isn't there a danger
Of what?
of...
Racism is always a danger, any kind.
Yes, but isn't there a danger of... I don't know whether you've seen some of the meetings that go on nightly up in Harlem.
Oh, yes, I have.
Black nationalists.
Yes.
Do you think that's a good idea?
Oh, at this moment I do, yes.
You do, really?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely necessary that people who are just coming into their own in the world must be as dramatic about it as they possibly can, must embrace all causes, must embrace all methods.
You know, when the Reverend Martin Luther King was stabbed, it was said that one of the reasons that there was so much feeling about him up there was because he had decided to autograph his book in a Jewish store on 125th Street rather than in a Negro store. Were you aware of that?
No, I don't even know who said that.
And there have... I don't know whether you've gone up to any of these meetings up there.
I've lived in Harlem, I go to Harlem often, and I've heard nationalist meetings.
Well, there's talk of black supremacy. There's talk against any kind of integration. There's considerable anti-Semitic talk that takes place in these street corner meetings.
Well, the anti-Semitism I have never heard as part of these meetings. Anti-white, which is quite different. If the Jewish merchant within the community is thought of as an enemy,
An
thought
exploiter.
of as he's thought of as a white person, and this is the personification. Anti-Semitism is not a part of this, and it's unfair to impose it on it. It isn't true, I don't think.
Well, I can give you book, chapter, and verse on it, and there's a good deal of talk about the Zionist-communist axis up there. As a matter of fact, one of the tenets of black nationalism, as we have begun to find out about it, is its very anti-Zionism, trying to link Zionism to communism, and a considerable amount of anti-Semitic talk that goes on nightly.
Well, that I would actively disassociate myself from. Actively. I find no excuse for anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. I would have been eager to say so publicly when our friends from the African countries couldn't find their way clear to invite Israel to the cocktail party and so on.
But even black racism, you do understand?
I'm not talking about black racism. Let's keep in mind what we're talking about. We're talking about oppressed peoples who are saying that they must assert themselves in the world. Now, personally, I hope that I believe most of all in humanism. I'm not interested in color. I've fought against color prejudice all my life. I'm not interested in having white babies murdered any more than I can countenance the murder of Kikuyu babies in Kenya. I hate all of that kind of thing. But let's not equalize the oppressed with the oppressor and saying that when people stand up and say that we don't want any more of this, that they are now talking about a new kind of racism.
Well, there is...
My position is that we have a great deal to be angry about, furious about. You know, it's 1959 and they're still lynching Negroes in America. And I feel, as our African friends do, that we need all ideologies which point toward the total liberation of the African peoples all over the world.
Miss Hansberry, I surely thank you for coming and spending this very short half hour. I wish we could go on about this at some length, and perhaps I can invite you back to do that sometime.
To reclaim the African past. Radio interview with Studs Terkel, May 12, 1959.
Always intrigued me. The African suitor. Remember,
My favorite character.
He's a remarkable figure. Who is he? What is his meaning in this particular play in contrast to the others?
He represents two things. He represents, first of all, the true intellectual. This is a young man who is so absolutely confident in his understanding and his perception about the world that he has no need for any of the facade of pseudo-intellectuality, for any of the pretenses and the nonsense. He can already kid about all the features of intense nationalism because he's been there and he understands beyond that point. He's already concerned about the human race on a new level. He's a true, genuine intellectual, so that he doesn't have time or interest except for amusement in useless passion and useless promenading of ideas. That's partially what he represents. The other thing that he represents is much more overt. I was aware that on the Broadway stage they have never seen an African who didn't have his shoes hanging around his neck, and a bone through his nose or his ears or something. And I thought that even just theatrically speaking, this would most certainly be refreshing, And what this fellow represents in the play is the emergence of an articulate and deeply conscious colonial intelligentsia in the world. I'm very much concerned and caught up in the movements of the African peoples toward colonial liberation out of colonialism. And he represents that to me. He also signifies a hangover of something that began in the 30s when Negro intellectuals first discovered the African past, particularly in poetry and the creative arts.
The culture that was there.
Yes, I still feel this way. I want to reclaim it.
The great culture that is there, that has been, that was stolen, too.
Oh, sure. And which may very well make very decisive contributions to the development of the world in the next few years. I suspect it's going to.
I'm sure it will. There's a point...
Assegai is an angry young man who can be very quiet in his anger. The African student.
You say he is an angry young man. As a point I want to raise, when Sidney Poitier and Leon Bibb, his friend, the singer, were interviewed, they spoke of the young student. They says he's an idealist. He would have a rough time. Now, they say Nkrumah and Kenyatta are very practical men. And he would have a rough time in the power battle as such. He might be sort of hamburger squeezed between two forces.
They were saying that Assegai, the African student in the play, as opposed to men like Kenyatta and Nkrumah, is an idealist.
Yeah, they were saying that he may be just taken.
Except that this man has an ideological preparation for that. In fact, in one sense, he gives the statement of the play. I don't know how many people get it, but he does. She says to him, you're always talking about independence and freedom in Africa, but what about the time when that happens, and then you'll have crooks and petty thieves who come into power, and they'll do the same things, only now they'll be black, So what's the difference? And he says to her that this is virtually irrelevant in terms of history, that when that time comes, there will be Nigerians to step out of the shadows and kill the tyrants, just as now they must do away with the British. And that history always solves its own questions, but you get to first things first. In other words, this man has no illusions at all. He just believes in the order that things must take. He knows that first, before you can start talking about what's wrong with independence, get it, and I'm with him.
Integration into a burning house? From a radio symposium on the Negro Writer in America, January 1st, 1961.
What are we faced with? We are faced with the fact that due to these 300 years of the experience of black people in the Western Hemisphere, not only in the United States, that a possible difference of ultimate cultural attitude now exists as a reality. So that there are the tones now of Negro nationalism articulated in a far more sophisticated and pointed way than perhaps years ago, where the question is openly being raised today among all Negro intellectuals and among all politically conscious Negroes. Is it necessary to integrate oneself into a burning house? And we can't quite get away from it. There are real and true things existing in the consciousness of Negroes today which have to do with why, on two different occasions, the Negro delegate at the United Nations will disassociate herself from her government. When we refuse to vote for Algeria, an Algerian Algeria, when we refuse to vote for the end of colonialism, that the most compromised element from which these people are drawn, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to represent us, when they are moved to disassociate themselves in an international hall, and when 10,000 Negroes will come out to greet Fidel Castro in Harlem and wave at him and cheer him every time he shows his head, this is an indication to our country. This dichotomy is going to become more articulate, and we are going to see it more and more in Negro literature. You said, I thought rather beautifully, a number of times, how this question, the Negro question, does tend to go to the heart of various and assorted American agonies, beginning with slavery itself. And I am so profoundly interested to realize that in these 100 years since the Civil War, that very few of our countrymen have really believed that their federal union and the defeat of the slavocracy and the negation of slavery as an institution is an admirable fact of American life. So that it is possible now to get enormous books on the Civil War and go through the back of them and not find the word slavery, let alone Negro. We've been trying very hard. This is what Jimmy and I mean when we speak of guilt. We've been trying very hard in America to pretend that this greatest conflict didn't even have at its base the only thing it had at its base, where person after person will write a book today and insist that slavery was not the issue. They tell you that it was the economy, as if that economy were not based on slavery. It has become a great semantic game to try and get this particular blot out of our minds. And people spend volumes
discussing the battles of the Civil War and which army was crossing a river at 5 minutes to 2 and how their swords were hanging. And the slavery issue we have tried to get rid of. To a point that while it has been perfectly popular, admirable, the thing to do all of my life, since Gone with the Wind, to write anything you wanted about the slave system with beautiful ladies in big fat dresses screaming as their houses burned down from the terrible, nasty, awful Yankees, that this has been such a perfectly acceptable part of our culture, that the first time that I know of that someone came to me and asked me to write 90 minutes of television drama on slavery, which, if you will accept my own estimate, was not a propaganda piece in either direction, but I hope a serious treatment of family relationships by slave-owning family and their slaves. This is controversial. This has never been done. They asked me for it, they paid me for it, and if I may say so, in contradiction to everything we've said, Langston, rather well. And then I read in the newspaper that some studio official, it's irrelevant which network, had attached a notation to it saying, moreover, which no one had bothered to tell me, that they thought it was superb, and then they had put it in a drawer. Now, when all those millions of Americans went out only a month or two ago and voted for a federal president, presumably, in a culture which does not respect the fact that if the North had not won, if the Union forces had not triumphed over slavery, that this country that we're talking about would be a lot of imagination, and Americans today are ashamed and frightened to take a position even on this.
The Black Revolution and the White Backlash. Speech and remarks at Town Hall Forum, June 15, 1964.
How do you talk about 300 years in 4 minutes? Was it ever so apparent we need this dialogue? I wrote a letter to the New York Times recently which didn't get printed, which is getting to be my rapport with the New York Times. They said that it was too personal. What it concerned itself with was I was in a bit of a stew over the stall-in. Because when the stall-in was first announced, I said, oh my God, now everybody's going crazy, you know, tying up traffic, what's the matter, you know, who needs it? And then I noticed the reaction, starting in Washington and coming on up to New York among what we're all here calling the white liberal circles, which was something like, you know, you Negroes act right or you're going to ruin everything we're trying to do, you know. And that got me to thinking more seriously about the strategy and the tactic that the stall-in intended to accomplish. And so I sat down and wrote a letter to the New York Times about the fact that I am of a generation of Negroes that comes after a whole lot of other generations. And my father, for instance, who was, you know, real American type American, successful businessman, very civic-minded and so forth, was the sort of American who put a great deal of money, a great deal of his really extraordinary talents, and a great deal of passion into everything that we say is the American way of going after goals. That is to say that he moved his family into a restricted area where no Negroes were supposed to live, and then proceeded to fight the case in the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And this cost a great deal of money. It involved the assistance of NAACP attorneys and so on. And it is the way of struggling that everyone says is the proper way to do, and it eventually resulted in a decision against restrictive covenants, which is very famous, Hansberry versus Lee. And that was very much applauded. But the problem is that Negroes are just as segregated in the city of Chicago now as they were then. And my father died a disillusioned exile in another country. That is the reality that I'm faced with when I get up and I read that some Negroes my own age and younger say that we must now lie down in the streets, tie up traffic, stop ambulances, do whatever we can, take to the hills if necessary with some guns, and fight back, you see. This is the difference. And I wrote to the Times and said, you know, can't you understand that this is the perspective from which we are now speaking? It isn't as if we got up today and said, you know, what can we do to irritate America? You know, it's because that since 1619, Negroes have tried every method of communication, of transformation of their situation, from petition to the vote, everything. We've tried it all. There isn't anything that hasn't been exhausted. Isn't it rather remarkable that we can talk about a people who were publishing newspapers while they were still in slavery in 1827, you see? They've been doing everything, writing editorials, Mr. Wexler, for a long time, you know. And now the charge of impatience is simply unbearable. I would like to submit that the problem is that, yes, there is a problem about white liberals. I think there's something horrible that Norman Podhoretz, for instance, can sit down and write the kind of trash that he did at this hour. That is to say that a distinguished American thinker can literally say that he is more disturbed at the sight of a mixed couple, or that anti-Semitism from Negroes and anti-Semitism from anybody is horrible and disgusting, and I don't care where it comes from, but anti-Semitism somehow from a Negro apparently upsets him more than it would from a German fascist, you see. This was the implication of what really gets to him. Well, you have to understand that when we are confronted with that, we wonder who we are talking to and how far we're going to go. The problem is we have to find some way with these dialogues to show and to encourage the white liberal to stop being a liberal and become an American radical. I think that then it wouldn't, when that becomes true, some of the really eloquent things that were said before about the basic fabric of our society, which, after all, is the thing which must be changed, you know, to really solve the problem. You know, the basic organization of American society is the thing that has Negroes in the situation that they are in, and never let us lose sight of it. When we then talk with that understanding, it won't be so difficult for people like Mr. Wexler, whose sincerity I wouldn't dream of challenging. When I say to him, his sincerity is one thing. I don't have to agree with his position. But it wouldn't be so difficult then for me to say, when someone uses the term Cold War liberal, that it is entirely different, you see, the way that you would assess the Vietnamese War and the way I would, because I can't believe I can't believe that anyone who is given what an American Negro is given, you know, our viewpoint, can believe that a government which has at its disposal a Federal Bureau of Investigation which cannot ever find the murders of Negroes, and by that method and shows that it cares really very little about American citizens who are black, really are over somewhere fighting a war for a bunch of other colored people, you know, several thousand miles. You just have a different viewpoint. This is why we want the dialogue, to explain that to you. See, it isn't a question of patriotism and loyalty. My brother fought for this country, my grandfather before that, and so on. That's all a lot of nonsense when we criticize. The point is that we have a different viewpoint because we've been kicked in the face often, and the vantage point of Negroes is entirely different. And these are some of the things we're trying to say. I don't want to go past my time, thank you. I, for one, would like to identify my position. Radicalism is not alien to this country, neither black nor white. And we have a very great tradition of white radicalism in the United States. And I've never heard Negroes boo the name of John Brown. With white kids on the firing line in Mississippi as we're sitting here. So there's no problem no matter how excited we get, I think ultimately anybody at this table who wants to read any patriot out of the Negro movement, it's not the point. Some of the first people who have died so far in this struggle have been white men. And I, for one, would be prepared, I must say, an exception to anything said, to accept the leadership of a person who gives that much devotion as against someone who would exhibit the traitorous characters of say, a Moise Tshombe. I don't think that we can decide ultimately on the basis of color, that kind of thing. The passion that we express should be understood, I think, in that context. We want total identification. It's not a question of reading anybody out. It's a merger, but it has to be a merger on the basis of true and genuine equality. And if we think that it isn't going to be painful, we're mistaken. Just one thing I wanted to allude to, I think as the movement goes on, we each see our place and we get into it, you know. I know that you, for instance, are an admirer of our late president, and he presumed, with all respect to the dead, but he happens to have been our president, so I have to talk about him that way, to have suggested to the world that if our foreign policy were not honored with regard to Cuba, that we would blow up the world, you see. And we live in a nation where everything which is talked about is talked about in terms of the fact that we are going to be the mightiest, the toughest, the roughest cats going, you know, in the whole world. And when a Negro says something about, I'm tired, I can't stand it no more, I want to hit somebody, you say that we're sitting here panting and ranting for violence, you know? It's not right. I think it's very simple. I think it's very simple that the question of the whole idea of debating whether or not Negroes should defend themselves is an insult. If anybody comes and does ill in your home or your community, obviously you try your best to kill them.
We are one people. Remarks to a civil rights rally, Croton-on-Hudson, New York, June 16, 1963.
My name is Lorraine Hansberry. I'm a writer. I think you know that I am your neighbor in Croton, and I'm very proud of our community. I understand we have more than 100 people outside today. And it's my privilege to be the chairman of this meeting this afternoon, which has assembled all of us here in response to an extraordinary mood in our country, to a very great mood in our country, one which now presumes to finish up the unfinished business of American life, the disgraceful unfinished business of American life, a mood which dares to present to the American people as a whole the fact that while it is proper, as I always do, to observe that there really is no such thing as the new Negro. And I am always emphatic about it because, among other things, I try to be something of an amateur student of Negro history. And there hasn't been a period in the history of this country, or for that matter, the New World, when the Negro people have not fought valiantly, persistently, for their freedom. As one person said, it is not particularly new that Negroes are now determined to fight for their voting rights throughout the South. What is new is that the atmosphere in the world is so completely different that the solution that the races used to apply at will, which was simply to drop the insurgents into the local rivers around Dixie, is now different. A new world. And the responsiveness of our people to that fact is the thing I think that draws all of us here this afternoon. The responsiveness of the people of Birmingham and Jackson and throughout the South, and representatives of which we have with us this afternoon. Finally, I think we are all, if not to the point of exhaustion, heard of the meeting that some people, myself among them, had with the Attorney General of the United States not too long ago. And there were many references that became famous on that occasion. One of them that I'm proud to say, since it was my remark, had significance then, and I'm going to repeat it, most of us there felt was the telling statement. It was when, during the genuine heat of the discussion, and our speaker today, Mr. Jerome Smith, had indicated to the Attorney General that the passion and the absence of patience of a sorely oppressed Native American people is beyond anything that we can sit around and be polite about anymore, that the Attorney General exhibited some impatience. And it was at that juncture, and feeling free, that I was speaking for every single Negro and indeed white ally in that room, as there were, that I suggested that the Attorney General re-examine his impatience, because while there might be in that room some of the celebrated figures of whom we all know, the qualitative change in the struggle for Negro freedom was that we are not remotely interested in the old insulting concept of the exceptional Negro. We are not remotely interested in any tea at the White House. That what we are interested in is making perfectly clear that between the Negro intelligentsia and the Negro middle class and the Negro this and that we are one people, and as far as we are concerned, we are represented by the Negroes in the streets of Birmingham.
My government is wrong. From a speech to a mass meeting to abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee, Manhattan Center, October 25th, 1962.
Young people speak today with a candor that's quite new in the world. If after all the ambition in life is merely to be rich, then all that might threaten that possibility is much to be avoided, is it not? This means, therefore, not incurring the disfavor of employers. It means, how can one protest against the possibility of war if one expects to draw one's livelihood, as an engineer say, from the aircraft industry? How can one write plays which have either implicit or explicit in them a quality of detestation of such commerciality, if in fact one is beholden to the commerciality of the professional theater? How can one even protest the criminal persecution of political dissenters if one has already discovered at 19 that it is safer not to do so? How indeed can one have the deepest, most profound moral outrage about the fact of the condition of the Negro people in the United States when one has it dinned into one's ears day after day that the only reason why perhaps that troublesome and provocative group of people must someday be permitted to buy a cup of coffee or rent an apartment or get a job is not because of the recognition of the universal humanity of the human race, but because of all the disgraceful things in the world. It happens to be of extremely expedient international politics to grant these things. As I stand here, I know perfectly well that such institutions as the House Committee and all the other little committees has dragged on its particular obscene theatrics for all these years, not to expose communists or do anything really in connection with the security of the United States. They have done it merely to create an atmosphere where, in the first place, I would not come here tonight at all, and second of all, that I would not say what I am going to say, which is, I think that my government is wrong. I would like to see them turn back our ships in the Caribbean.
Cuban people, to my mind, and I speak only for myself, have chosen their destiny. And I don't happen to think, as someone brought up in the traditions of our country, that it is the place of the descendants of the American Revolution who never asked anybody for permission to become a republic to now interfere in that fact of life any place in the world. Still speaking only for myself and exercising this right, I would go so far, speaking as a Negro in America, to impose a little of what Negroes say all the time to each other, to you. But not only might they turn back the ships, but turn to the affairs of our country that need a righting. And for one thing, empty the legislative and judicial chambers of victims of political persecution so that we know why that lamp is burning out there in Brooklyn. And while they're at it, go on and help fulfill the American dream and empty the southern jails where the genuine heroes, practically the only last vestige of dignity that we have to boast about at this moment in our history. That we let those students out of the jails, which is part of our national disgrace at this moment, that this is where young people have to go to ensure what is already on the books. And I would go so far, perhaps with an oversense of drama, but not so maybe, and suggest that maybe, without waiting for another 2 men to die any place in the South, that we send some of those troops on the way to the Caribbean now to finish the reconstruction in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and every place else where the fact of our national flag flying creates the false notion that what happened at the end of the Civil War was the defeat of the Slavocracy. And I say not merely in behalf of the black and oppressed, but for a change, and more thoughtful Negroes have to begin to make this point, but for the white and disinherited of the South, for the poor whites of the South who by the millions have been made the tragic and befuddled instruments of their own oppression at the hands of the most sinister political apparatus of our country. I think perhaps if our government would do that, it would not have to compete in any wishful way for the respect of the new black and brown nations of the world. Finally, I think that all of us who are thinking such things exercise this right that we're talking about tonight and say them to my fellow artists, paint them, sing them, all of the things that are not currently fashionable to do. Otherwise, all else happens, in my opinion, to be idle and luxurious complicity, and no other thing. I personally agree with those who say that from here on in, if we are to survive, we the people, still an excellent phrase, we the people, have to oblige all the heads of all governments responsible to us, the world's people. I think that it is imperative to say no to all of it. No to war of any kind, anywhere. And I think, therefore, that it is imperative to remove from the American fabric any and all such institutions or agencies such as the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which are designed expressly to keep us from saying no. Thank you.
Towards a New Black Leadership, speech on the 15th anniversary of Monthly Review, May 15, 1964.
As we all know, the most exciting and purposeful events which are occurring in our country are those which involve the efforts of the Negro people of the United States to wrest their birthright of full citizenship from a laggard and oppressive nation. It is, contrary to the myth, an old struggle. There is, in fact, no such thing as the new Negro, if by that term we are made to understand that the present militant surge of the Negro people is without historical precedent. I make a point of saying this everywhere. It seems to need a great deal of emphasis. After all, even though it's not as well known as it should be, the Negro people have sustained one of the most heroic resistances to tyranny in the history of man. Our African ancestors came to the New World, fighting slavery by mutiny on the high seas and by suicide. The very character of slavery in the United States was defined by the black man's repudiation of his enslavement, which he daily did battle with by sabotage, work stoppage, acts of violence against those who enslaved him, and of course, most telling of all, by running away by the thousands from slavery. And when the time came to help give the fatal blow to the slave system, Negroes, now by the tens of thousands, fell into the ranks of Abraham Lincoln's Union Army to serve in any way they could to destroy that hideous cancer against human dignity that was the Confederacy. Black folk in America have historically regarded education with reverence. Every moment that could be spared, the ex-slaves begged and harassed his liberator to teach him the alphabet. Beyond that, I suppose it required some intimacy with the cultural tradition and folkways of Negroes to know of the esteem in which education is held. All the more poignant and ugly, then, that the withholding of education has been one of the prime instruments of the oppressors of American Negroes. Oppressors who have seen to it that when education could not be entirely withheld, that it could certainly be made substandard. I am, for instance, the product of a Jim Crow grade school. And one result of that fact is that to this day I cannot count properly. This despite the fact that my reading scores as a grammar school pupil supposedly reflected the capability of the exceptional or so-called gifted child. Apparently something had to suffer. I was given, during the grade school years, 1/2 of the amount of education prescribed for each child by the Board of Education of my city. This was so because the children of the Chicago ghetto were jammed into a segregated school system. To this day, I do not add, subtract, or multiply with ease. Our teachers, devoted and indifferent alike, had to sacrifice something to make that system work at all. And in my case, it was arithmetic, which got put aside most often. Thus, the man which was able to grasp the university-level reading materials in the 6th and 7th grade had not been sufficiently exposed to elementary arithmetic to make even simple change on grocery store errands. This is what we mean when we speak of the scars, the marks that the ghettoized child carries through life. To be imprisoned in the ghetto is to be forgotten at best, or to have one's birthright deliberately cheated at worst. Equipment, books, actual building space are all cut back on when it comes to the ghetto child. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. I'm speaking of what was not then an old building. On the contrary, it was a relatively new and modern building. It had been built that way purposefully, without adequate facilities. Its substandard quality had been planned from the drawing board. From its inception, it had been earmarked as a ghetto school, a school for Negro children, and therefore one in which as many things as possible might be safely thought of as expendable. After all, that's why the building was built. That's why the ghetto itself was and is maintained, not to give education, but to withhold as much as possible. Just as the ghetto exists not to give people homes, but to cheat them out of as much decent housing as possible. If one is really to speak of the hatefulness of the oppressive system under which Negroes live, then no matter how much one despairs to confront such facts, one must. For at this moment, the paramount crime in the United States is the refusal of its ruling classes to admit or acknowledge in any way the real scope and scale and character of the oppression of Negroes. Well, that oppression is not a random, helter-skelter, hit or miss matter of discrimination here and there against people who just happen to be a different color. It's not that at all. It is, as that ruling class perfectly well knows, a highly concentrated, universal, and deliberate blanket of oppression pulled tightly and securely over 20 million citizens of this country. This matter of admitting the true nature of a problem before setting about rectifying it is of utmost importance. It can not only save a great deal of suffering on the part of Negroes, but it could also save considerable embarrassment on the part of the rulers of this nation. For that is what their present course has been destined for, the gravest embarrassment. As we all know, there is something which we may call the civil rights game, which goes on in this country, and it's being played right now in Washington. It is a game in which individuals, and indeed whole classes of individuals, who are in every way imaginable committed to the perpetuation of the oppression of Negroes, pretend for a whole variety of fashionable reasons that they are not. A portion of those who play this game go so far as to pretend that not only are they against the present condition of Negroes, but they should like to alter that condition for the better, and according to the rules of the game, they are designated by their co-players as civil rights champions. And depending on what is happening on a given day, they debate with one another on the best methods of stalling Negro demands for equality while appearing to be laboring in behalf of Negro equality. Naturally, whenever Negroes assert that their situation is intolerable, these game players point to the game which is going on and say that if those Negroes do not shut up, they will stop playing altogether and reveal their true sentiments with regard to Negro freedom, which of course would be one of the healthiest things that could happen in this not so healthy country. That is why I've come here this evening to celebrate with you the recognition of the fact that there is only one place from which that desperately needed pressure on the game is going to come from when all is said and done. And it's going to come from 20 million discontented black people who, however, must be led by a new and presently developing young black leadership. A leadership which must absolutely, if the present revolt is to turn into a revolution, become sophisticated in the most advanced ideas abroad in the world. A leadership which will have had exposure to the great ideas and movements of our time. A Negro leadership which can throw off the blinders of parochialism and bathe the aspirations of the Negro people in the realism of the 20th century. A leadership which has no illusion about the nature of our oppression and which will no longer hesitate to condemn not only the results of that oppression, but also the true and inescapable causes of it, which of course is the present organization of American society. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. For more information about the broad range of titles from Harper Audio, Harper Children's Audio, and Cadman, please visit our website at harperaudio.com. Thank you for listening.